The day my best friend was murdered, I was standing in line at a grocery store. Part 2. A few minutes later, I was driving down a narrow road that wound through the forests outside Red Oak. Bill's note rested on the passenger seat beside me. The address led to a cabin on the northern edge of Blackwater Lake. Remote, quiet, forgotten. Exactly the kind of place somebody would choose if they wanted to disappear. I parked several hundred meters away from the property and switched off the engine. The sudden silence felt strange, almost unnatural. For a moment, I sat there staring through the windshield. Part of me hoped I was wrong. Part of me hoped Sarah was already safe, far away from the men who murdered Bill. Unfortunately, hope had never been a reliable strategy. I grabbed my gun and unlocked it, then stepped out into the darkness. The night air was cold. The forest smelt of pine and damp earth. I moved carefully through the trees, keeping my footsteps light. Memories of the life left behind flashed in front of my eyes, the kind that never truly disappear. The cabin eventually came into view through the branches. A single-story structure positioned near the edge of the lake. Modest, unremarkable, the sort of place nobody would notice. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Lights glowed through the windows. No signs of trouble. I remained hidden within the tree line and observed. Patience first, movement second. A lesson that had saved my life more times than I could count. A few moments later, the front door opened. 2 men stepped outside. I immediately recognized them. The federal agents. The same men who had escorted Sarah to the church. Neither man appeared relaxed. Both carried sidearms. Both looked tired. But they were doing their job, protecting Sarah. A few minutes passed. Then I noticed movement through one of the cabin windows. Sarah. She was pacing, back and forth, like somebody trapped inside her own thoughts. She looked like a prisoner waiting for bad news. Maybe she already knew about Bill. Or maybe she simply sensed something was wrong. Either way, she didn't look like the same woman. I considered approaching. Part of me wanted answers immediately. The other part wanted to make sure I wasn't bringing danger directly to her doorstep. So I stayed where I was, watching, waiting, trying to decide what to do next. Then I heard it. The distant growl of engines. Several of them. Moving fast. Every instinct I possessed immediately came alive. The agents heard it too. Both men turned toward the road at exactly the same moment. And suddenly, I knew something was very wrong. The agents reacted immediately. Years of training took over. Both agents withdrew their weapons and stood by the doorway. Neither man hesitated. Neither man wasted a second. The growl of engines became a roar. Then headlights burst through the darkness. 3 black SUVs tore down the dirt road leading to the cabin. The vehicles didn't slow down. They accelerated. The first SUV skidded sideways across the clearing. The second stopped near the tree line. The third blocked the only road leading away from the lake. It wasn't an arrival. It was an ambush. Doors flew open. Armed men poured out. Rifles, body armor, night vision equipment. This wasn't some local criminal gang. These men had come prepared. The younger agent fired first. A sharp crack shattered the silence. One of the attackers dropped immediately. The response was instantaneous. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The forest exploded into noise. Muzzle flashes illuminated the darkness. Bullets tore through trees. Windows shattered. Wood splintered from the cabin walls. The younger agent dove behind a stack of firewood and continued firing. The older agent positioned himself near the porch. Both men were hopelessly outnumbered, but neither gave an inch. I remained concealed inside the tree line, watching, calculating, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find Sarah. Then I saw her. She appeared briefly in one of the windows. Her face was pale. From fear. She looked exactly like someone whose worst nightmare had finally found her. The older agent shouted something. I couldn't hear the words, but Sarah immediately disappeared from view. The firefight intensified. One attacker attempted to rush the porch. The older agent dropped him before he reached the steps. Another moved around the side of the cabin. The younger agent caught him halfway there. For a brief moment, it looked as though they might actually hold the attackers back. Then reality caught up. The attackers had numbers, positions, and the attackers were willing to spend lives to reach Sarah. A burst of automatic fire ripped through the clearing. The younger agent staggered, then collapsed behind the woodpile. He never moved again. The older agent saw it happen. For the briefest moment, something crossed his face. Not fear. Acceptance. The kind I've seen in soldiers who understand exactly how their story ends. He fired 2 more rounds. Then another burst struck him. The agent stumbled backward onto the porch railing. His rifle slipped from his hands, and he fell. The cabin suddenly felt exposed. Vulnerable. Defenseless. I knew what came next. The attackers knew it too. Several men immediately sprinted toward the front door. I had enough. I stepped out from the tree line and raised my gun. The first man dropped before he reached the porch. The second spun toward me. I fired again. He collapsed beside the steps. Suddenly, every gun in the clearing shifted toward my position. The attackers had found a new problem. Me. Bullets slammed into the trees around me. Bark exploded from trunks. Dirt erupted at my feet. I threw myself behind a fallen log and returned fire. One man fell. Then another. But there were too many of them. Far too many. Then the cabin door burst open. My stomach dropped. Sarah. 2 men were dragging her outside. She fought like hell. Kicking, punching, twisting. One of the attackers struck her across the face. The blow nearly dropped her. But she still fought. Still refused to surrender. The sight made something inside me snap. I rose from cover and fired. One attacker ducked. The other shoved Sarah toward the nearest SUV. Then I saw him. The blonde-haired man from Bill's office. The man from the recording. The man who murdered Bill. Even from across the clearing, I recognized those cold eyes. Those cold, empty eyes. For a brief moment, our gazes met. He wasn't surprised to see me. He wasn't angry. He looked amused. As though he already knew how this would end. As though my failure had always been part of the plan. I squeezed the trigger. Nothing. The gun clicked. Empty. My magazine was dry. I reached for another. Too late. The blonde-haired man climbed into the SUV. The door slammed shut. The engines roared to life. As the convoy began pulling away, Sarah saw me. For a brief moment, our eyes met through the window. Recognition flashed across her face. Then hope. Then panic. Axel. Her voice cut through the chaos. She slammed both hands against the glass. Axel, help me. I ran. Ignoring the gunfire. Ignoring the danger. Ignoring everything except the terrified woman disappearing into the darkness. But people don't outrun vehicles. The SUVs accelerated. The distance widened. Sarah's voice grew fainter. Then vanished entirely. The SUVs disappeared beyond the trees. And just like that, she was gone. For several seconds, I simply stood there, breathing hard, listening to the silence settling over the clearing. The gunfire had stopped. The engines were gone. Even the insects seemed unwilling to make a sound. The forest felt dead. I looked down at the empty magazine still clutched in my hand, then toward the road where the vehicles had vanished. I had been too late. Bill trusted me, and I failed again. The realization hit harder than I expected. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I wasn't an operator. I wasn't the man I used to be. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe the version of me that could have saved her years ago. I pushed the thought aside. Self-pity wasn't going to help Sarah. I forced myself to move. The older agent lay beside the woodpile, a rifle still clutched in his hands. I checked for a pulse anyway. Nothing. The younger one had fallen near the porch steps. Same result. Both men were gone. But judging by the way they fought, they had stayed exactly where they needed to stay. Long enough to give Sarah a chance. Long enough to buy time. Long enough to die doing their jobs. I walked into the cabin. The place was painfully ordinary. A small living room. An old couch. A dining table. A cramped kitchen. No family photographs. Or decorations. No signs that anybody intended to stay there permanently. The cabin wasn't a home. It was a hiding place. I checked every room carefully. Closets. Drawers. Cabinets. Nothing. No documents. No laptops. No clues. Which made sense. People living under protection rarely leave evidence lying around. I was about to leave when something caught my attention. The couch. One side sat slightly uneven, almost as though it had been moved recently. I crouched beside it and saw a corner of a folder protruding from underneath. My pulse quickened. I carefully pulled it free. The first page contained Sarah's photograph. Not church records. Not parish information. Official documents. Federal documents. The kind that immediately tell you you're looking at something far bigger than you expected. I sat down and began reading. The deeper I got, the worse it became. Witness Protection Program. Protected witness. Federal relocation. Threat assessment. The words seemed impossible. Yet there they were. In black and white. Sarah Bennett wasn't hiding from an abusive partner. She wasn't running from debt collectors. She wasn't escaping some local criminal. She was hiding from some organization powerful enough to force the federal government to relocate her entirely. I turned another page. Then another. Eventually, I found the identities of the two men outside. Special Agent Robert Hayes. Special Agent Glenn Smith. The same men I had seen escorting Sarah to the church were now lying dead in the clearing. Suddenly, everything made sense. The gray sedan. The secrecy. The fake records. The constant fear. Bill hadn't been protecting a vulnerable woman. He'd been protecting a witness. A witness somebody desperately wanted silenced. I continued reading. Most of the file was heavily redacted. Entire sections had been blacked out. Names removed. Locations concealed. Evidence withheld. But one detail remained visible. The original case jurisdiction. New York. I stared at the page. New York. The answer felt important. Important enough that the government had somehow failed to hide it. Important enough that Sarah's enemies crossed state lines to hunt her down. Important enough for Bill to die protecting her. I closed the file and leaned back. For the first time since Bill's murder, the bigger picture began taking shape. This wasn't about Sarah alone. This wasn't even about Bill. Whatever she knew, whatever she had witnessed, it terrified somebody. Somebody powerful. Somebody organized. Somebody willing to kill repeatedly to keep a secret buried. Then I heard sirens in the distance. Faint at first. Growing louder. Local law enforcement. Maybe more federal agents. Maybe both. Either way, I had no interest in explaining my presence at a crime scene littered with bodies, especially while carrying documents connected to a federal witness. I gathered the file and returned to my vehicle. I left before the first patrol cars reached the cabin. The road out of the forest wound through the hills before eventually connecting to the highway. I drove in silence. The file rested on the passenger seat. The events of the night replayed endlessly in my head. Bill's murder, Sarah's fear. The blonde-haired man. The ring, the insignia. Eventually, I entered a destination into my navigation system. A small cafe in New York. Most people would have considered it unremarkable. To me, it represented something else. A door. One I hadn't opened in years. A connection to a life I promised myself I would leave behind forever. For several miles, I stared at the road. Debating. Questioning. Wondering whether I was about to make a terrible mistake. Then I picked up my phone. The number hadn't changed. Some things never do. It rang 3 times. Then a familiar voice answered. Hello. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The years seemed to disappear instantly. Finally, I took a breath. It's me. Silence. Then surprise. Axel. I looked at the dark highway stretching ahead of me. Time to return a favor, I replied. The next day, after driving continuously, I was seated at one of the private booths in the cafe. I was waiting for Clive Jacobs, a CIA agent whose life I had saved a few years ago in Syria. He had told me that he owed me. As I was swirling the coffee, I noticed a man in his mid-40s walking towards me. He was carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and a brown duffel bag in the other. Clive arrived 20 minutes late. Some habits never change. He slid into the booth opposite me and immediately frowned. You look terrible, he commented. I've looked worse, I said, giving him a small smile. He studied me for a few seconds. Then his expression changed. You didn't call me after all these years to talk, did you? No, I said. I slid Sarah's file across the table. Clive opened it. The moment he saw the photograph, his face tightened. Where did you get this? He asked, narrowing his eyes at the file. Long story, I replied, expressionless. His eyes moved to me, then sighed heavily. He closed the file and said, You have any idea what you've stepped into? No, I replied, that is why I am here. Good, he replied, leaning back, and continued, because if you did, you'd already be on your way home. I wasn't amused by what he said. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Sarah Bennett is a protected witness. That confirmed what I'd already suspected. Protected from who? I asked. The Obsidian Circle, he replied. The name immediately caught my attention. What is it? I asked. A criminal empire, Clive replied ominously. His answer was simple. Then he continued to speak, the kind that owns judges, politicians, police officers, and businessmen. I listened silently as Clive continued. The man at the top is Victor Draven. He pulled a file from his briefcase and placed it on the table. He pulled a photograph out of that file and slid it in front of me. I picked it up and studied it carefully. The insignia on Victor's lapel immediately caught my eye. The same symbol I'd seen on the ring of Bill's killer. Then I picked up the file from the table. Inside it was another photograph of a man with blonde hair and cold eyes. I recognized him instantly. It was the same man that pulled the trigger on my best friend. The same man that smiled at me at the safe house where Sarah was taken. Under the photograph was the name I was looking for. Lucas Draven. I showed the photo to Clive and asked him, What can you tell me about him? Clive leaned forward to get a good look. He replied, Lucas Draven, Victor's evil little brother, the heir to the throne. Victor hands him the most important tasks, and Axel, Lucas, is not discreet about the way he handles those tasks. I stared at the photo for a minute, rage rising in my soul. "What happened to Sarah?" I asked. Clive shook his head and said, "She is in witness protection. Nobody knows where except the FBI." I looked straight into Clive's eyes and said, "Not anymore." "What do you mean, not anymore?" Clive asked worriedly. "Last night she was taken from her safe house. The agents protecting her were killed," I replied. "And how do you know that?" he asked, raising his eyes. I remained silent. Clive did not press further. He knew better than to ask me again. I looked at Victor's photograph again, then at the insignia. Then back at Clive, I asked, "That's all you have?" Clive nodded. "That's all I'm willing to give you." "Why?" I asked. His eyes hardened, looking down at the brown duffel bag placed at his feet. "Because whatever you're planning, I don't want to be part of it." For a moment, we simply stared at each other. Then Clive quietly added, "Walk away, Axel," knowing fully well I wasn't going to. I stood up quietly and picked up the brown duffel bag. Before exiting the booth, Clive said softly, "Axel, now we are even." I turned around and looked at him, waited for a brief moment, and nodded once. For the next few hours, I became someone I hadn't been in years. A hunter. I visited places connected to Sarah's old life. Apartment buildings, parking garages, coffee shops, anywhere she might have visited before entering witness protection. Most of it led nowhere, but investigations rarely move in straight lines. Eventually, I found something. A parking ticket, forgotten inside a storage box at her old apartment. At first glance, it looked worthless. Then I noticed the location. Pier 17, Brooklyn Dockyards. The ticket was only 6 months old, far newer than anything else I'd found. That alone made it interesting. I visited the dockyards that evening. The place was enormous. Containers stretched toward the horizon. Cargo cranes loomed over the waterfront like steel giants. Thousands of people worked there every day. Finding anything useful should have been impossible. Then I saw it. A gray sedan, parked beside a warehouse near the eastern edge of the property. The same gray sedan that had watched the church. The same gray sedan that fled Red Oak. The same gray sedan that disappeared after Sarah was taken. I watched it for nearly 2 hours. Nobody entered. Nobody left. Then shortly after sunset, a blonde-haired man stepped out of the warehouse. Even from a distance, I recognized him instantly. The man who murdered Bill. Lucas Draven. And just like that, I knew I'd found Sarah. It was nearly 1 in the morning when I decided to make my move. From a distance, it looked less like a shipping facility and more like a military compound. Floodlights illuminated entire sections of the property. Patrol vehicles moved methodically between rows of containers. Armed guards occupied elevated watch positions, overlooking the entrances. The Draven brothers clearly weren't the kind of men who believed in taking chances. I parked nearly a mile away and approached on foot. The brown duffel bag hanging from my shoulder contained enough equipment to start a small war. A suppressed handgun, spare magazines, body armor, night optics, a combat knife, and enough ammunition to make sure I wasn't walking into this place unprepared. A final gift from Clive, one that suggested he didn't entirely believe his own advice about walking away. I spent nearly 30 minutes observing the dockyard before making my move. Patrol routes, camera sweeps, guard positions, entry points. Nothing happened quickly. It never does. It's about patience. The men who rush are usually the men who die, quickly. When I finally moved, it was because I knew exactly where every guard would be for the next 90 seconds. I cut through a section of fencing, hidden behind stacked containers, and slipped inside. From there, the real challenge began. The deeper I moved into the facility, the more security I encountered. Motion sensors, additional patrols, checkpoints with restricted access. Victor hadn't built an empire by trusting luck. He trusted preparation. The same reason he was still alive. At least for now. I eventually reached the administrative section, overlooking the warehouse floor. 2 armed men guarded the entrance. Neither looked particularly relaxed. Then I created a distraction near the far end of the corridor. One guard immediately went to investigate, while the second remained behind. The first guard disappeared around the corner, and I made sure he never returned. The second guard realized something was wrong just before my knife found his heart. Neither man had time to raise an alarm. I moved deeper into the building. As I climbed a staircase toward the executive offices, voices drifted through the walls. Several men were gathered around a table. On the table were maps, documents, photographs. One image immediately caught my attention. It was Sarah. Another was Bill. Crossed out, like a completed objective. The sight made my blood run cold. I continued forward. Room by room, floor by floor. Everywhere I looked, I found evidence of the circle's reach. Financial records, political contacts, photographs of judges, police commissioners, business leaders. The deeper I went, the more I understood the empire Victor Draven was running. Then I heard muffled voices coming from one of the offices. Victor's name was on the door. Lucas's voice was impossible to mistake. Confident, arrogant, dangerously calm. I positioned myself outside Victor's office and opened it a crack. Inside, the brothers were arguing. Victor stood beside the window, overlooking the dockyard. Lucas sat comfortably, with his boots resting on the desk. The contrast between them was striking. Victor ruled through control. Lucas ruled through fear. Both were dangerous, for different reasons. You killed a priest, Victor said. Lucas shrugged. He wouldn't cooperate, Lucas said casually. You made a mistake, Victor said irritably. I made progress, Lucas retorted. Victor turned slowly, and for the first time, genuine anger appeared on his face. You still don't understand what you've done. Lucas smiled and said, No, I understand perfectly. You are scared and I solved that problem. If you don't like the way I do things, then maybe do it yourself next time. Victor stared at him, then quietly said, Lucas, one day your arrogance will destroy this organization. Lucas laughed. The sound carried no humor whatsoever. I'll worry about that after we find the book, he said confidently. My attention sharpened. The book, I thought to myself, was it the evidence Sarah had been protecting? Then Victor asked the question I'd been waiting to hear. Has the girl regained consciousness? Lucas shook his head, not yet. Good. Sarah was still alive. And that was all I needed to know. Using the blueprints Clive had provided, I began searching the lower levels. I searched section by section, room by room, avoiding all guards. It took another 20 minutes before I found her. She was being held inside a reinforced storage room at the far end of the building. When I opened the door, she was lying against the wall, unconscious and bruised, but alive. Relief hit me harder than expected. For a moment, I simply stood there, making sure she was breathing, making sure I wasn't too late. Eventually, her eyes opened. Confusion appeared first, then disbelief, then recognition. "Axel," she asked weakly. I smiled and said, "Good to see you too." Before she could say anything else, I helped her to her feet. "We need to leave," I said, putting her arm around my neck. The drugs hadn't fully worn off. She stumbled several times as we moved through the corridors. Every second increased the chances of being discovered. Unfortunately, luck finally ran out. The office door opened. Lucas stepped into the hallway. For one frozen moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then his hand moved toward his pistol. So did mine. The corridor exploded into gunfire. Bullets shattered glass. Lights burst overhead. Alarms immediately activated throughout the building. The quiet infiltration ended. And the war began. Men poured into the hallway from every direction. Trained men. Well-armed men. The kind who knew exactly how to fight. Unlike the guards downstairs, these weren't security personnel. These were professionals. For nearly 10 minutes, the building became a battlefield. I fought room to room, hallway to hallway, dragging Sarah with me whenever I could. Lucas coordinated his men with frightening efficiency. Even under fire, he remained calm. 3 separate times he nearly killed me. And 3 separate times I survived by inches. Then I finally hit him. A round struck his shoulder. Lucas crashed backward down the staircase. His scream echoed throughout the building. Victor appeared moments later. Unlike Lucas, he wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He simply stood there, watching, as though he still believed himself untouchable. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he shouted. I lowered my weapon. "I know exactly who you are." Victor reached for a concealed pistol. He never got the chance to use it. The fight ended quickly. For all his power and influence, Victor Draven wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hunter. He wasn't a survivor. When it was over, he collapsed onto the office floor. The empire he'd spent decades building died with him. The alarms continued screaming. The sirens outside were getting closer. Federal agents, police, the entire world was closing in. Sarah emerged from cover. Together, we made our way toward the staircase. Lucas was still alive. Barely. His breathing sounded wet, labored, painful. His leg was broken from the fall. Yet when he saw me approaching, he smiled. Even when he was broken and dying, he smiled. "You." I crouched beside him. He recognized me. The forest. Everything finally connected. "Who are you?" he whispered. I looked directly into his eyes. "The priest you murdered." His smile disappeared. "I am the consequence, the punishment," I whispered softly and coldly. Lucas understood immediately. For the first time since I'd met him. He looked afraid. I stood over Lucas's broken body, raised my gun. My eyes still locked into his. The gunshot echoed through the stairwell. Then there was silence. Real silence. Not the kind that exists between gunshots. The kind that exists after everything is finally over. I stood there waiting for relief. Waiting for justice. Waiting for peace. None of them came. Only exhaustion. Because standing over Lucas Draven's body, I realized something painful. The man Bill saved years ago still existed. But so did the soldier. And tonight the soldier had won. Outside, emergency vehicles flooded the dockyard. Sarah stepped beside me. "You saved me." I looked toward the approaching lights, then back toward the darkness behind us. "No, Bill did." My voice sounded tired. Together we walked toward the exit, toward the sirens, toward the dawn, and away from the ghosts that had followed me all the way from Red Oak. 6 months had passed since New York. 6 months since I moved out of Red Oak. Far away. I eventually settled in a small farming town called Ash Hollow, Nebraska. I bought a modest piece of farmland on the edge of town. It reminded me of Red Oak. Not because it looked the same. Because it felt the same. It wasn't exciting. And that was exactly why I chose it. A few weeks after moving, Clive called. It was the first time we'd spoken since New York. His message was simple. The Obsidian Circle was finished. Not completely. Organizations like that never disappear overnight. But the damage was catastrophic. Sarah had handed over the book after her rescue. Inside were decades of secrets. Names, payments, bribes, political favors, criminal operations. Enough evidence to destroy careers and dismantle networks that had operated in the shadows for years. The fallout became national news. Federal judges resigned. Police officials were arrested. Corporate executives disappeared into courtrooms and prison cells. Several politicians suddenly announced unexpected retirements. Others weren't given that option. The investigation stretched across multiple states. Every week seemed to bring another arrest, another indictment, another scandal. The empire Victor Draven spent decades building collapsed faster than anyone thought possible. According to Clive, the official story surrounding the dockyard incident was creative. The FBI had no interest in explaining that a retired Delta Force operator had infiltrated a criminal fortress, rescued a federal witness, and dismantled the leadership of a criminal empire in a single night. So they didn't. Instead, reports described an internal power struggle. Victor and Lucas Draven had supposedly turned on each other after disagreements over the future of the organization. The resulting conflict escalated into violence. And because by the time federal agents arrived, both men were dead. Most people accepted the explanation. The public always prefers simple stories. As for me, my name never appeared in a single report. Never appeared in a single investigation. Never appeared in a single news article. Officially, I never existed. And honestly, that suited me just fine. The last thing I wanted was recognition. Recognition wouldn't bring Bill back. But what brought me some peace was that Sarah was safe. Back with her family, trying to build the ordinary life she'd nearly lost. We never spoke after the dockyard. Not once. And I think that was for the best. Sarah and I shared a chapter, not a future. And that was okay. Some endings don't need anything more. Which is why I found myself back in Red Oak. Back where all of this began. The cemetery sat exactly where I remembered. Untouched by everything that had happened. I walked between the rows of headstones until I reached Bill. A fresh breeze moved through the trees. The church bell echoed faintly in the distance. For a moment, it almost felt like he was still here. I placed a bouquet of white lilies beside the headstone and stood silently. The words didn't come immediately. Eventually, I took a deep breath. "Hey, Bill," my voice sounding smaller than I expected as I looked down at the engraved letters on the stone. Then continued, "You know, I spent a long time convincing myself that what I did was necessary." The cemetery remained silent. So many people tell themselves that. I stared at the ground. Remembering the faces. Remembering the gunshots. Remembering the version of myself I thought I'd buried years ago. Lucas deserved what happened to him. I paused. Victor too. Another pause. Longer this time. But I still don't know if that makes it right. The admission felt heavier than I expected. Because it was true. For 6 months I'd carried the same question. One I could never answer. Justice and revenge often wear the same face. The difference only becomes clear after everything is over. And by then, it's usually too late. I looked toward the church beyond the cemetery. The same church where Bill had given me a second chance. The same church where he lost his life protecting someone else. A small smile found its way onto my face. You once told me that I am exactly who God wanted me to be. The memory felt distant now. Almost unreal. I didn't believe you then. I looked back at the headstone. Most days I still don't. The breeze picked up again. And for the first time in months, the guilt felt lighter. Not gone. It would never be gone. Some burdens stay with us forever. But lighter. And sometimes that's enough. I nodded slowly. Wherever you are, my voice choked briefly. I hope you understand. I hope you forgive me. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Like the conversation was complete. Like there was nothing left to say. After a while, I turned and started walking back toward my truck. The sun was beginning to set beyond the fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. The same colors Bill and I used to watch from the church steps months ago. I didn't look back. Not because I was forgetting him. Because I wasn't. I never would. Some people leave footprints on your life that time can never erase. And Bill was one of them. My name is Axel Graves. And this is the story of how I hunted the people that murdered my best friend, trying to protect an innocent life. It's the story of a witness who refused to surrender, a friend who refused to betray his principles, and a soldier who learned that some battles don't end when the shooting stops. But if there's one thing Bill taught me, it's that redemption isn't something you find. It's something you choose. Every single day. And for the first time in a very long while, I think I'm finally ready to try. Click the link in the description for part 1.